In southern Syria, the region of Sweida, which is mainly populated by the Druze community, has been caught in a wave of violence. This is a place that, until recently, was relatively peaceful compared to other parts of Syria. But now, tensions are rising. Bedouin fighters, a group of tribes from the region, have clashed with local Druze militias, and the violence is escalating fast. The conflict began when Bedouin groups started engaging in territorial disputes with the Druze militias, who are loyal to the Syrian government. These disputes turned into open fighting, and the situation has only gotten worse. The Syrian government, under interim leadership, had to step in to prevent the violence from spreading further, as this conflict threatens the fragile stability that the country has been trying to build after years of war. As a result, the government has deployed forces near Sweida to regain control of the area and prevent the Bedouin fighters from advancing. However, this intervention hasn't been easy. The region is diverse, with both Druze and Bedouin communities, and the government's response to the fighting is only making things more complicated. There are also a lot of civilian casualties, and the people of Sweida are caught in the middle of a fight they never asked for. The situation is critical because if it gets worse, it could lead to more widespread instability, affecting not just Sweida, but the entire southern region of Syria. So, the government's main goal right now is to bring back some sort of order and prevent the conflict from spiraling out of control. The trouble in Sweida didn't start overnight. It's part of a bigger picture involving long-standing divisions between different groups in southern Syria. Over the years, there's been a lot of competition for land and resources, especially between the Druze community, which has deep historical ties to the area, and the Bedouin tribes who've also lived in the region for generations. The situation started to heat up after the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime in 2024. This caused a power vacuum, meaning no one was fully in charge of the region. As a result, different groups began to try to fill the gap, each seeking to take control of the region's resources and influence. Both the Druze and the Bedouin tribes saw this as an opportunity to push for more power, leading to increased tension. Things got worse in July 2025 when a series of kidnappings occurred. Some Bedouin tribesmen were kidnapped by Druze militias, and in retaliation, Bedouins took Druze hostages. This set off a chain reaction, with both sides accusing each other of violent acts and atrocities. As the violence grew, it quickly spread beyond just Sweida, affecting neighboring areas. The Syrian government tried to intervene by sending in troops, but their presence only fueled the fire. While they intended to stop the violence, their actions often ended up making things worse. Local ceasefire agreements fell apart, and soon, the fighting escalated to full-scale battles. The Syrian government has struggled to restore peace, mainly because the issues at hand are far deeper than just military intervention. These are problems rooted in history, power struggles, and deep-rooted mistrust between the groups involved. In response to the rising violence in Sweida, the Syrian government had no choice but to step up its efforts to restore order. They decided to deploy more troops to the region, hoping that a stronger military presence would calm things down and prevent the Bedouin fighters from taking over. The government's plan was simple: send in the military, block the Bedouin fighters, and regain control of the region. The problem is, the situation wasn't that simple. The military's move into Sweida wasn't without challenges. For one, the region is extremely difficult to navigate, and getting enough troops and equipment into the area proved to be a huge logistical headache. The Bedouin fighters, familiar with the terrain, managed to hold their ground for longer than expected. On top of that, the locals didn't always see the Syrian forces as allies. The Druze and Bedouin groups have had their own long-standing tensions with the government, and having Syrian troops come into the area only added to the distrust. This complicated the government's efforts to maintain peace. While some locals supported the idea of government troops bringing stability, many others saw it as an invasion. Despite these problems, the Syrian forces set up security checkpoints around the city, hoping to control movement and block the Bedouin fighters from advancing any further. They also launched several raids aimed at dismantling Bedouin militia groups. The government's goal was to crush any remaining resistance and restore calm, but as you can imagine, the presence of the military only stirred up more anger and resistance from both sides. In the end, the government's response was a temporary fix. The forces managed to bring some calm, but the underlying issues, the distrust, the competition for resources, and the deep-seated rivalries, remained unresolved. The government's deployment didn't solve the problem, it just pushed it further down the road, leaving room for even more conflict in the future. As the fighting in Sweida continued to intensify, it became clear that the situation wasn't just a local issue anymore, it was drawing the attention of the international community. The violence in southern Syria threatened not only the peace in the region but also the stability of neighboring countries. That's when countries like the United States, along with Arab states and even Israel, got involved, pushing for a ceasefire agreement. The United States, seeing the potential for the conflict to spread, took the lead in brokering a ceasefire between the two sides. After several rounds of talks, the government and the Bedouin militias agreed to a temporary truce. The idea was to stop the fighting long enough to allow for aid to reach the region and to give both sides a chance to cool down. But even with the ceasefire in place, things were far from peaceful. Both the Druze and Bedouin fighters had their own reasons for wanting to keep fighting, and it wasn't long before violations of the ceasefire were reported. In fact, just days after the agreement was signed, there were reports of skirmishes and new clashes breaking out. The ceasefire seemed fragile at best. Adding to the complexity was the involvement of Israel. Israel has a history of supporting the Druze community in Syria, and with the violence spilling over into the region, Israeli airstrikes were reported to have targeted Bedouin militia positions in support of the Druze fighters. This external intervention made things even more complicated, as it introduced yet another actor into the already chaotic situation. Despite all the efforts to broker peace, the ceasefire has been hard to enforce. The international community continues to call for dialogue and negotiations, but it's clear that a lasting solution will require more than just temporary agreements. The situation remains tense, and it's uncertain how long this ceasefire will hold, if at all. As the violence in Sweida drags on, the people living there are bearing the brunt of the conflict. The ongoing clashes between the Druze militias and Bedouin fighters have caused severe damage to infrastructure and left many civilians without access to basic needs. Hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties, and many families are being forced to flee their homes in search of safety. The situation is becoming a full-blown humanitarian crisis. Basic services like water, electricity, and healthcare have been disrupted, making life even more difficult for the people in the region. Families are struggling to survive as food and medical supplies become harder to find. Local hospitals, already stretched thin, are doing their best to treat the injured, but they're quickly running out of resources. In some areas, there are reports of people being forced to wait for days before they can get the treatment they need. Over 87,000 people have been displaced so far, many of them heading towards the nearby city of Damascus or into neighboring regions where they hope to find some shelter. But these displaced individuals are often met with the same challenges: limited resources and a lack of proper housing. Refugee camps are filling up, and the situation is becoming increasingly dire. Humanitarian aid, which is essential in times like these, has been slow to arrive. Access to the region remains difficult due to ongoing security concerns, and the distribution of aid is often delayed. Even though some convoys have made it into the region, they can't meet the overwhelming demand for supplies. This means that many families are left to fend for themselves, facing an uncertain future. With no clear end to the violence in sight, the humanitarian situation in Sweida will continue to worsen. Civilians, who are already caught in the middle of this conflict, are paying the highest price. Looking ahead, it's clear that the path to lasting peace in Sweida is anything but certain. While the recent ceasefire has temporarily halted large-scale fighting, the underlying issues remain unresolved. The Druze and Bedouin communities have deep-rooted tensions that have built up over years, and these issues won't just disappear with a few peace talks. For real peace to take hold, both the Syrian government and local communities will need to come together. This means opening up dialogues that involve not just the military leaders but also ordinary Druze and Bedouin citizens who are affected by the conflict. These discussions should focus on finding ways to address the root causes of the fighting, like resource distribution, power sharing, and protection of local traditions and autonomy. The government must also do more than just deploy forces to maintain control. It must work to win the trust of the local communities. This means providing equitable access to resources, ensuring that minority groups are represented in decision-making processes, and addressing the political and economic needs of the region. Without these changes, any peace agreement will only be temporary, and the cycle of violence could easily resume. The role of the international community remains crucial, but it must go beyond just brokered ceasefires. There needs to be more long-term support for rebuilding the region, addressing humanitarian needs, and fostering genuine reconciliation. The road to peace in Sweida may be long, and the risks of renewed conflict are high,